Actually, would you do me a favor? I'd like to take a photo and all look as though you're asleep. And I will send this back to my friends and I'll say, look at the fantastic impression. So please look as though you're asleep.
Wszyscy zamykamy oczka, zasypiamy.
1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Okay, preparing for this interview, I read a lot of stuff about Ocean and listened to a lot of stories available on the internet told about Ocean, and most of them went like, there is a terrible situation, or there is a conflict, or there is something horrible bound to happen, and then Gary Bracey comes in, and then everybody's happy and everybody feels safe and it's lovely and fluffy. So this is the kind of person we're going to talk about. A man who was one of the authors of the success of Ocean and is usually credited with more than the actual founders and leaders of the company. It seems that, or you could get the impression, you can prove it false, or you can try to fight it, but you can often get the impression that Gary was one of the most important, if not the most important, force in the company. But in terms of video games, he started. Oh, there's Simon. We'll talk about Simon later on. Don't go anywhere, Simon. You started out in terms of video games. You started out as a shopkeeper, right? So
That's
could
right.
you tell us a bit about the beginnings of your career in the industry?
Well, it's not very interesting, so I'll be brief. I was really into computer games. I saw in the early days, I bought an Acorn Atom, and I loved the computer games. I'd already been addicted to arcade games, and so I realized, I thought it would be a great way to earn a living if it was possible. But I had no technical expertise. I could not program. I couldn't draw anything at all. So I figured the only thing I could do is sell video games. And so I opened up one of the first computer game stores in Liverpool. I rented shelves in a video library. And a year later, I'd made enough to open my own shop called Blue Chip in one of the high streets in Liverpool. And that's how I really got into computer games. There was a very big community. This was in Liverpool, and there was a very big development community in Liverpool with Imagine, Bug Bite, Software Projects, and then just down the road in Manchester, Spectrum Games, which became Ocean, and a few others. And it was already a bit of a community, and I knew quite a few people, came across people like Simon and a lot of the Imagine guys. But I was a little frustrated being a retailer. I knew John Woods quite well, who was one of the founders of Ocean, and one day I was talking to him and he asked how things were going, and I said they're going fine, but I'd love to get into the production side of games. And he said, well, we need someone to manage the development of Ocean. They had a small in-house team at the time, very talented team, likes of Joffa Smith and Dave Collier and Mike Webb, but they were struggling with some of the external developments that were going on, and they wanted someone to manage that process. So I thought, well, I play games, I speak to people who buy games, so I hopefully have a reasonable feel of what people want. So yeah, I'd love to do it, and I joined Ocean, I think it was 83. Sorry, no, it was 85. 1985, and started overseeing the development of Ocean Software.
I was wondering if we could still stick to this earlier time, because I think it was a very interesting market, right? But when you were still selling games. For those of you who don't know, the actual beginnings of Ocean, still as Spectrum, were that they were putting out advertisements of games they hadn't even started making to see what the interest would be, right? And these were mail order games, so people started paying them, and then they said, okay, we have like 3 weeks until we send these things, so let's make them, right? And they kind of did. So what was it like? You know, what was the distribution like? What were your contacts with the distributors? How did you get the games? How did you, run around looking what games were interesting and which were not?
Well, that sort of whole culture about advertising the game before they'd actually conceive the game was a little bit before my time. But Ocean had already built up very, very strong connections with the big distributors and the big outlets in the UK, particularly like WH Smith's and some of the large chain stores. So they already had the distribution. Ocean were excellent at marketing. I mean, I think in many ways, Ocean are credited, and this has nothing to do with my input at all. This is more to do with David and John. They were great marketeers of the games. So they would market the brands. They had great artwork on the inlays, which were done by Bob Wakelin. And this actually, I think, encouraged people to discover computer games because they looked so interesting in the magazines, and they went beyond the computer magazines and publicized the games in the mainstream, and certainly Imagine had a lot to do with that as well. So I think in some ways Ocean accelerated the adoption of computer games in those very, very early days. And as I say, that had nothing to do with me. That was before my time. But I think Ocean did a remarkable job in that regard.
Okay, and when you came to Ocean, what kind of changes did you personally make in the company, or what kind of changes were affected by your presence?
Well, the walls weren't very nice, so I had the walls as I say, a lot of the games were being developed externally, outside, and it was obvious that the really quality games were being produced in-house by the small in-house team. And the external games, and when I was brought in, we had two specific games. One was Street Hawk, and three games. One was Street Hawk, one was Knight Rider, and one was Miami Vice. And they were being designed and developed by external studios. And no one had been out there to go and see them. They'd been paid a certain amount of money and told, get on with the game, we need this in 3 months or whenever it was. So I went down, and I remember one of these companies was in Brighton, which was a long way away from Manchester. And I drove down there, I went to look at where it was, and it was terrible. It was just rubbish. The game was rubbish, it looked rubbish, and they obviously hadn't been working on it. They'd been too busy spending the money that they'd been advanced. So it made me realize that if we were to start creating quality product, we needed to bring that in-house. So over the coming year, we needed to recruit really good talent and bring them in-house. And obviously people like Simon, Mike Lamb, Dawn Drake, John Megan, we brought all these really, really talented people in-house and gave them our jewels, our best titles, which were normally the licensed titles, to develop, because A, we could oversee and understand how it was progressing, but also we knew that it was in good hands, and these very, very creative and talented people would create something that was pretty good.
Okay, and you participated in something that was quite a breakthrough for the British game development scene. Namely, when you look at the games back then, in the mid-1980s, you had American games and then not much else. And then when you looked at British games, you would usually expect them to be cheap knockoffs of some other properties or some weird examples, but generally not that interesting or not of that quality. And then Britain started to emancipate, as it were, to become appreciated. And I think this is a particularly interesting story and a particularly interesting process, because then it was repeated several times. In the early 1990s, it happened to the French games, right, which were not really appreciated anywhere outside of France. And then suddenly you see French games can be really interesting. they have a sort of unique twist, and you start to appreciate them. And then, perhaps most importantly for our location right now, the same thing happened to Central and Eastern European games, right? Which were supposed to be cheap crap, basically, until a certain moment when people realized, oh, there are fascinating things going on here as well. So how was the struggle for breaking into the world markets, and how did you do that?
It was it was difficult at first because the key format in the UK was the Sinclair Spectrum, and that was very much a UK or slightly European machine. The US was really driven by the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64, which we did develop for, but we focused more on Spectrum because I think in the early days we sold more Spectrum games than C64 games. I've always believed that the best talent came from Europe. I mean, I'm biased. I mean, we were in the UK. We had remarkable talent in the UK, but in Europe generally, and I'll include Eastern Europe in that, I believe our creative and technical talent really was so superior to that was being created in the US. Japan was a different silo. Japan had remarkable stuff, obviously led primarily by Miyamoto, but I've always believed, and still do, that the best talent is in Europe. And what happened in the 90s is we saw this huge migration of that talent over to the US, because whilst we, and I'll say Europe and UK specifically, whilst we had the best talent, the US had the most money. And so they were able to pay people to go over there. And Ocean lost a lot of really good people over to the US who were lured by the money and the sunshine and everything else. But I still maintain we have the best and most creative talent. So I've forgotten what the question was now.
How was the process of getting more and more appreciated?
So the way we got a foothold into the US market was through the licenses, because they weren't interested in whizball or head over heels or anything. They've never heard of it. But if we created a great game based on RoboCop or Platoon or Untouchables or Addams Family, then that was something they recognized. And so that gave us a foothold into the US, which allowed us a few years later to create our own company, Ocean of America, in San Jose, and not just publish from that locality, but also we had a development studio there as well. So that's the way we got into the US, which was a lot more difficult than what the Americans did, because they had the money to expand. We didn't, apart from the money we made, but there was no external investment into video games.
Mm-hmm. And there was one more notable relationship that you had, and this was the relationship with Japanese companies. And here you were also a pioneer, and you had excellent relationships with Data East. You had great relationship with Nintendo. Again, how did this work?
That was more down to John Woods. He spent a lot of time developing relationships, particularly with the arcade companies. And at the time, when we first got our relationship with the Nintendo, they were a coin-op company. They weren't a console company. And we were the first third party to actually be allowed to develop a Nintendo game, which was Mario Brothers, which I think was done by Alan Shaw, wasn't it? And we developed a great relationship, so that when the Nintendo console became popular, we already had that relationship, which allowed us to be one of the first UK or European companies to be allowed to develop and publish on that platform. The coin-op companies like Taito and Konami in particular, and quite a few others, we had great relationships with. We used to go out to Japan an awful lot. We'd look at all the coin-ops, select which ones we believed were going to be popular in Europe, and then port those games across to those particular formats. And it was very, very successful and lucrative for both Ocean and the coin-op companies themselves.
Okay, and we've been moving gradually towards the question of the movie franchises, which Ocean became notable for. And Gary was instrumental in that with a special method that Ocean had. Instead of waiting to see if a movie would be successful, Ocean were trying to anticipate the success of a movie. And this involved Gary reading scripts before the films were made and then checking out the interesting ones and then supporting them. The most important bet here and crucial for Ocean was RoboCop, which could have, when it was still a script, people thought, well, it could go both ways. And Gary was one of the first people to believe so strongly in RoboCop, and it paid over time. So could you share any interesting stories or any interesting anecdotes about your famous trips to Hollywood?
I don't remember them. Yes, well, it's quite interesting because I think Platoon was the game that made the difference, because Platoon, which was a really good game, which again I think Simon was involved with, he was instrumental. Simon takes credit for great graphical work, but what a lot of people probably don't realize is his design ability, and Simon was key in some of the greatest game designs that Ocean put out as well. One of those was Platoon, and Platoon was the first game that was multi-level. In other words, the entire game wasn't one type of genre. It was divided into subsections to try and follow the story of the film. And that had never been done before, to the best of my knowledge. So what happened was Platoon was a good commercial success. And for us, that made the movie companies realize that they could actually make money from computer games, rather than just saying, we'll license you this computer game, give us $10,000 or $20,000, and that was it, which was normally what we had to pay for a guarantee. They earned a lot more royalties from that, and they started earning perhaps six figures, which was unheard of back then. So they started to take video games a lot more seriously. And because of that, they started sending us lots of scripts, lots of movie scripts. And I was, John and David weren't interested. I loved movies, so I actually looked at every script that was sent, and I've still got a lot of them at home. And I'll probably tell you later some of the strange ones that were sent. But in amongst these, Orion, which was the company who produced Platoon, they sent us this script called RoboCop. And what we normally did was we evaluated a movie license based on its popularity. And usually that movie was already in the can, it was already produced. So we were able to look at the movie and make a judgment as to whether it would be successful. Now we were in a situation where we could look at scripts and make that evaluation before the movie was made. So it was a lot more speculative. We got this script called RoboCop, which was by a relatively unknown director, Paul Verhoeven, back then. But the script was fantastic. It was just a video game on paper. And we felt that, yeah, this could make a really good game. So we went with that. It was an unknown director. It was a virtually unknown cast. The movie hadn't been made, so we got it really, really cheap. It was like $5,000, $10,000 guarantee. And that game became the most successful game Ocean had ever had. And it was one of the first million-selling games. And it was a phenomenal throughout the world. It wasn't just UK or Europe. It was massive in the US. It was massive in Japan on the Nintendo. And it marked a really big change for Ocean and got us a lot more credibility, which enabled us in turn to acquire some much higher profile movie licenses like Batman, Jurassic Park and the rest. It really opened the door.
And this is because this affair between video games and film has been going on for some time, and my idea is that it's kind of cyclical, which is it sort of returned at some point. It returned every 10 years with people from the game industry going to Hollywood, talking to the Hollywood people. Usually the two sides not really understanding each other very well, and this will be part of the question in a moment, how well you were able to communicate with the film people. there is always, or there used to be always this one guy who was really good to talk to, and it would be Steven Spielberg. And you also had your conversations with Steven Spielberg. And well, I think Spielberg, well, his last involvement with video games was like 10 years ago probably, or something like that. He even established a company. He'd been trying to reach out to the video game industry and the other way around. And I think your wave of communicating with Hollywood was one of the crucial ones for video games after the catastrophe of E.T., right? Because this I think broke down the communication for a long time. So how well did you communicate with the film industry? How much did they want to understand about games really? And to what extent was it just a token relationship? They gave you the scripts, you gave them the games.
I think, Hollywood sounds very glamorous and you've got all these film stars, but essentially like any business, they are driven by money. And you have the exceptions like Spielberg, who's super creative and is invested in the actual product. But most of the people, including mainly the licensing people you're dealing with, were just interested in how much money they could make. They weren't really bothered about the product. There were some issues about approvals and what was right and what wasn't right. I remember we did The Simpsons once, which wasn't a movie, and we worked really, really hard to get The Simpsons done on the Amiga, I think it was. We submitted it to Fox for approval, and it came back not approved. And the reason it wasn't approved was Bart's blink was off model. And what that means is, when we animated Bart Simpson, we animated his blink the normal way, where your eyelid goes to the bottom of your eye. In The Simpsons, they blink with their eyelids meeting in the middle, the bottom and top. And because we didn't do that blink, the game was not approved, and we had to redesign it. So there were lots of complications, but when you got involved with someone like Spielberg, who had a lot more freedom, obviously related to the spin-offs from the movie itself, such as the game, then he was very, very enthusiastic, he was very creative, he was very receptive. He was like a kid. He was so excited about what we could do with Jurassic Park. The problem we always had, and I think this is why movies aren't done for games these days, the problems we always had was the limited time frame, because by the time we got the license for the game, it was probably already in production and would be out in 6 to 9 months, the movie, which gave us relatively little time to design, to brainstorm and create the game and then hone it and tweak it the way we wanted. And these days, that's even more of a challenge because a game can take 3 to 5 years typically to be produced, which is way, way after the movie will be released. So I think in those days, that was our biggest challenge and our biggest problem. But, I had great access to the movie sets, so we were going to the sets of the likes of Batman, and I remember having a meeting with Tim Burton and watching the day's rushes, which was the raw footage that was filmed that day. And that was remarkable because I love movies, and I was very, very lucky, so lucky to be involved with that side of things. Spielberg, as I say, we went to the lot at Universal Studios, his Amblin lot, and we had a great conversation there, great brainstorming. I went to the set of Hook, which was another Spielberg movie, not a massively successful one, but I hate name dropping, but it sort of paints the picture. The likes of Dustin Hoffman and Robin Williams were there, and you saw them acting on the sets. There were so many different movies that we had access to, but it was very, very difficult to get the materials because they were notoriously secretive. So although I could go to the sets and visit the sets and see the amazing ships in Hook and the amazing locations that they were filming in, they would not provide us any visual materials because they had a PR department and a marketing department who would gradually leak that information to promote the movie. So we weren't allowed any of those materials. So I had to go back and speak to people like Simon and try and describe how that looked or how that worked, and they did a remarkable job in converting my stupid observations to something that looked pretty and fairly realistic. So it was always a challenge. I don't know whether that's changed now, but back then we were quite restricted in the materials we were given.
Okay, and as our time is drawing short, and I still want to have some time for questions from the audience, one last question about what you do today, because right now Gary is still in business, this time exploring the potential of virtual reality, right? So could you tell us something about what you're working on right now?
Sure. I've been very, very, very lucky to have been in this industry, this games industry, for 35 plus years. I love it, I love the people, but most of all, I love the creativity, and every new stage in new technology brings new creative challenges, and it's wonderful to be part of that and to work with such great talent. And VR, it was launched a couple of years ago, and to very little success. VR is coming. VR will be in mainstream in about 3 to 4 years. Once the units become a little bit more manageable and untethered and standalone, and AR as well, and those elements really interest me, and I can see massive potential, not just from a gaming perspective, but from a social and community perspective as well, and it's really exciting to be involved with that. So still interaction, still technology, and I'll probably be doing it until I die, which is probably quite soon with my lifestyle. But I'm enjoying it.
But still, wait until the end of the questions.
I'll try.
Okay, do we have any questions? By the way, if you want to see what Gary's doing right now, just Google Terra Virtua, right? This is his company and his project. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Why Europe has the best talent? What do you think?
Why does Europe have the best talent?
Yeah.
I think it stems from back in the day. When the Americans, for instance, had the Commodore 64, they had a lot more colors to play with, they had scrolling, they had a greater memory. Our machine was primarily the Spectrum, and in many ways, the 16K Spectrum. So we had to put an awful lot more into creating a game in much less memory, in much less graphical facility. And that, I think, gave us an advantage when they introduced console and cartridge, where you were very restricted in the amount of memory you had on the cartridge. Well, European developers were used to that restriction. And the Americans, although the Commodore 64 still had restricted memory, I think they were first with floppy disk. So it gave you a lot more memory generally, whereas we've always had to work within the constraints of limited memory. And that gave us a technical leg up and a technical advantage, which I believe we were able to take advantage of with not just the early consoles, but also mobile phones in the early days, which had tiny, tiny memory, which our developers were used to developing for. But equally, it's not just me who believes that we have the best talent. It's quite interesting, having grown up in this industry, as I say, over 35 years, I now go over to the US, and you look at the big companies like Activision, Microsoft, Apple, and a number of others, I can't think off the top of my head, EA. The senior people primarily are British or European. They are, and that's great, they all left from the law of money, but you will find that many of the top people in some of the top companies are British or European. And I think that, more than my opinion, I think that demonstrates how highly regarded the European development community is, and I think well deserved.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Hello. I have a question about the licensing because right now the license owners want to control how the product is being made. How was it in your times? Did the movie studios want to control how you develop the game, or they gave you a free hand and you could do what you want?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, we could do what we wanted creatively. The time they got involved, as I said earlier, was with approvals, was with the graphics more than anything. They didn't really bother so much about the game design, although I will say we had a problem with John Rittman's Batman, not Batman the movie. John Rittman made an isometric 3D Batman game, and what you had to do was you went around, your health would decline, and the way you got your health back was you would pick up a pill and take the pill, and that would restore your health. But no, Batman doesn't take drugs. So we had to change that to something else. I can't remember what it was. So, and then the Bart Simpson's Blink, and I remember when we did Batman the movie, that game was initially rejected because the ears were the wrong size by 2 pixels. So we had to change Batman's ears because they were off model. But that's the only time they really got involved. They didn't really get involved with the game design. We sent them the stuff for approval. I don't think anyone ever read the game's designs. Simon used to do some lovely storyboards, and they looked great, and they'd say, yeah, great, go ahead and do it. But we didn't really have any problems on the creative side, more on just the graphic side.
Okay, any other questions?
Do you also have examples of games where the movie didn't make it, that didn't become popular, but the game still sold well? For example, maybe it happened with Navy SEALs. I really loved that game on the Commodore Amiga 500.
Yes.
But I don't think the movie made it really big, although Charlie Sheen is in it. But
no, there were several. I mean, Flight of the Apache was another one. I mean, you must remember, when we got the script, it was quite speculative. We didn't know whether the movies were going to be successful. So what we did was we evaluated it. It had to be a good script, and we had to feel that it was going to be successful, but also whether the script itself would lend itself to a game. And Navy SEALs did. It was action, it was genre. So I always say there's a perfect storm. If the game was really good, and you quoted Navy SEALs, I don't know whether that was a great game, I can't remember, but if it was a good game, it would sell. It would sell quite well. But if the movie didn't succeed and the game was good, it would sell quite well. If the movie was great and the game wasn't very good, it would still sell quite well because of what we called the granny purchase, where granny would go to a store to buy a game for her grandson, and she'd look and she wouldn't know any of these games, but she'd recognize RoboCop or Batman, so she'd buy that game. So that was the value to us, and if the game was rubbish, which sometimes it was, then it would still sell because of that. But the perfect storm was when the movie was successful and the game was great as well. And unfortunately, we had a number of those with Batman the movie, RoboCop, Addams Family, which was personally, like Simon said, one of my favorite games that we ever developed. We had a number of great successes, and those games would absolutely fly.
Okay. Any other questions?
Can I just add one last thing? The reason I came here was I was told that back in the 80s in Poland it was very, very difficult to get the games, and so a lot of the games were pirated onto cassette. So I've come here to get the money from the games.
Okay, yes. The overt royalties. So you'll go back a millionaire, you know, because we're all guilty here. Okay, thank you for a great conversation, and thank you for the great questions. Gary Bracey,
Thank you
very
Thanks.
much.
Thank you.